Well, okay, today we're in Psalm chapter 58. This again is what is called by the theologians a imprecatory prayer. That is, where David is praying to God to punish the wicked. And in this section, the wicked happen to be unjust judges. And so, what David will do in three or four ways is say, well, let's just say, number one, he rebukes the justice for the unjust decisions that they make. And then he begins to describe the character and the judges. And then thirdly, he'll talk about the judges being judged or the consequences of their injustice. So let's take a look at the psalm here. We're looking at Psalm chapter 58 today. Now, in the beginning, again, David is challenging judges who are in powerful positions. And because they're in these powerful positions, they think they're invulnerable and cannot be touched. So David is going to challenge them and make them think about that someday they're going to have to give an account or report to the judge of all the earth. So let's look at this. It's an interesting section. Do you indeed speak righteousness? The answer, of course, is no. The idea of righteous there is justice. Do the just or do the judge speak righteousness? Does he make right decisions? Does he give the right sentence? And the answer, of course, is no. And he mentions that these are silent ones. Now, the Old King James has congregation, but the idea is they're silent when they should have pronounced righteous judgment. And the interesting thing about it is the Bible says that they weighed in verse number 2, which means that these decisions that they made were not because they had the wrong information or they just inadvertently made the wrong decisions. But what David is saying is that they had deliberately and thought through these unrighteous decisions that they made. So again, he'll say, do you judge uprightly in verse 1? And again, the answer is emphatically no. Now remember, these questions are going to be asked by the God of all the earth. And he's going to ask the same things that David did. He's going to speak to the judge and remind them there's a greater judge, and you better have the right answers, and they, of course, do not. Now, notice verse 2. Yea, in your heart you judge wickedness, and the idea is, or work wickedness, and the idea is it's in the intent of their heart. I mean, this is how their mind is working. It's not bringing in the facts, but they already have the intent to do what's wrong. And then he goes on to say, as I've already mentioned, they weigh the violence. That is, they have carefully thought through what they're going to do, and what they're going to do is absolutely wicked. They know they're doing it. And then he goes on to say here in verse number 3, the wicked. Now, you got to understand in verse 3 and 4 that David is using poetic language, and you'll see this in just a moment. I mentioned that before reading it because I think so many times when people read something that's poetic, they take it literally and forget that this is a figurative statement. Now, here's what I mean. The wicked are estranged, that is, they go away, they're strangers to God from the moment they're born. That is when they come out of the womb. And of course, a lot of folks get the wrong idea here, thinking that, that infant that comes out of the womb is already wicked. He's not saying that at all. If you read a little bit further, he's going to say, as soon as they are born, the moment that they are born, they speak wickedness. Now, David doesn't mean that literally. No infant that comes out of the womb can speak. It's going to take them a while. And all David is doing in a very poetic, figurative way is referring to the very depths of their sins. Now, in verse 4, he describes again their character, and that you'll see here is their poison is like the poison of a serpent or a snake. That is, and I hate snakes. I just hate snakes. I remember just as a young boy catching a little green snake, and and I had that in my hand, holding it by the neck and just watching those fangs just slip in and slip out. And that's what he's saying about these folks. They got the fangs, and of course they're not some little old green snake. They're talking about, boy, these are deadly snakes, and boy, snakes kill. And if they get their fangs in you, they're going to poison you. And that's what David is saying about these kind of judges. And he goes on to say, and even an adder, I think he might be referring to a cobra here, that stoppeth her ear and will not hearken to the voice of the charmer. And I don't know if you've seen those charmers on television, and they get those cobras, to wiggle out of an old piece of pottery vase, and as they play the flute, they can control the movements of a snake. And what David is simply saying, these judges are like snakes, and nothing can control them. They're on their own. They do what they want. And again, I'm referring to because of their position and their power, that they have this power to do what they want. And what they're doing wrong here is they're corrupt, and because of that, they're pronouncing evil and wrong decisions about innocent people. Now, in verse number 6, here's that imprecatory note that David has. He'll say, break their teeth, O God, in their mouth, break their great teeth of young lions. Now, of course, I don't want to be redundant, but you got to understand something here. Young lions are tough. They're strong. They're not like an old lion, laying under the bush, getting ready to die, can't kill anything anymore. They're strong and they're powerful. They're like young lions, you see. And what David is saying, take these old young lions, these corrupt judges who are in power, break their teeth, you see. And you can see how David is asking God to take care of the wicked. Now, and I mentioned yesterday, I'll just throw it in for just a moment, we ought to pray that God will deal with evil, and that only God can, because sometimes only God can handle people who are corrupt and in powerful positions. They feel, again, they can't be touched. They can't do nobody can do anything. And what he's asking God is for God to handle it. And I've said many times, you see, this is what you do in prayer. You take it to God, and again, you're pouring out your heart. He's just broken because of the corruptness. Maybe he felt the sting of it. He's been treated like a fugitive. He's been treated like a criminal for decades because of Saul, and he knows that he's not in a position to do much about it. And so he's called upon God, as we ought to. Let God handle it. Let God deal with it, and just take that prayer and process it there and leave it there. Now, notice here, he said, they will melt away as waters. That's like runaway water. You've seen runaway water, and after a while, that water, as it runs down the street, and it sooner or later it dries up and it vanishes away. And that's the idea here. He says, when he bendeth his bow to shoot his arrows, of course, they're shooting the arrows at David, they want to kill him. Now, notice again, let him be cut into pieces. Do you see how if anything, we ought to learn that word today, aren't we? Imprecatory. I mean, David wants God to deal with them and deal with them severely. Notice has a snail, that old slug. Aren't they kind of an ugly thing? Those old snails, slugs that they crawl along the sidewalk in the heat of the day. I'm told, by the way, that there's actually a thing called a slime worm, and that when it gets into the heat of the day, if it's out there on the street, it'll actually melt away. But he might just have in mind, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those slugs, they sort of leave a slimy trail. And again, all David is saying is, he wants them to pass away like an old snail. And then notice here this last phrase, it's rather important. Boy, if you can see this for a moment. What he's saying is like an untimely death or stillbirth death. Now, what David is saying here, that they may never see the sun. Now, I want to say something. There have been some very wicked people that have walked on the earth. There's a whole list of them. You could put Judas on it. You could put Hitler on it. You could have put Stalin on it. And the world would have been a better place. I mean, that's what he's saying here. He said, some of these people, I wish they had been born in death. They had been stillborn, and that they had never walked the earth because of the wickedness they'd done. The world would have been a whole whole lot better, he's saying, without them. Now, notice this, before your pots can fill the thorns. Now, all he's saying here is, the way they do it back in those days, they get some of that old brush and some of the thorn brush and bramble bush, and they would use that to heat the fire, start a fire rather, to heat under the pot. They'd throw that stuff under a pot. We throw it on a stove. I know that's not our image, but they would use that to get the old fire burned and heat up the pot. And when he says, and then of course the wind comes along, as that stuff's all burned up and it just blows it away. And so the sparks are really flying, aren't they? Both the living from his wrath. So here you go. The idea of the wind coming is the wrath of God, and he's going to blow those evil people away. Boy, isn't that a serious note? Now, in verse number 10, the righteous shall rejoice, not because God has blown away the wicked, but boy, again, I'll tell you what, the world would be better off without them. But the idea is the vindication. You see, these corrupt judges were, judging the innocent and rendering false verdicts and hurting people and doing all kinds of things, from robbing their lands to imprison them and even to kill them. And the time comes when the righteous will be vindicated, and God's going to do that. And so he'll say, so that man shall say, verily is the reward of the righteous. We can't talk a whole lot about that. We don't have much more time, but I just want to remind you that God is a rewarder. And if you live right, God's going to reward you. Verily, he is the God. Remember how we started it? He's the judge of all the earth. And so when people are in positions of power, and they can, by their own intent and ingenuity, and they're just able to do it, they ought to remember a few things in this particular psalm, that there is a judge of all the earth that sooner or later they're going to have to give account to. And that's what brings justice in the land. When we remember there is a God, and God will, of course, impose upon us justice. So there you go today. It's one of those tough prayers, but we're seeing a little bit about some of these prayers in the Psalms. I hope they're helping you as you pray to the throne of grace. And we'll be looking at next week as we move into we're in Psalm 59, I believe. And I hope to see you on Sunday.